In the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, thousands of miles from any coastline, a single cook aboard a British merchant vessel was about to change the course of the Second World War. His name was Thomas Mackenzie, and what he discovered in his cramped galley would render the most feared predators of the deep completely helpless. The German U-boat commanders called it impossible. Allied naval intelligence dismissed it as folklore. Yet this one man's seemingly absurd kitchen experiment would save more lives than any admiral's strategy or any engineer's innovation. You see, by 1942, German submarines were decimating Allied shipping lanes with ruthless efficiency. Convoys disappeared beneath the waves night after night, their cargo and crews lost to the silent hunters lurking in the darkness. The U-boat menace had grown so severe that Britain itself teetered on the brink of starvation. Every merchant ship that sailed carried not just supplies, but the desperate hope of an entire nation fighting for survival. But what if I told you that the solution to this maritime nightmare wasn't found in the war rooms of London or the laboratories of brilliant scientists? What if the key to defeating Hitler's underwater wolves lay hidden in something as ordinary as a ship's kitchen? Today I'm going to reveal the incredible true story of how one cook's crazy discovery turned the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic, saving countless lives and ultimately helping to win the war. Now, before we dive into this remarkable tale, let me give you some context about just how desperate the situation had become. By early 1942, German U-boats were sinking Allied ships faster than they could be replaced. The statistics were terrifying. In just the first 6 months of that year, over 3 million tons of Allied shipping went to the bottom of the ocean. That's more than 600 vessels, each one representing dozens of lives lost and precious cargo that would never reach its destination. The German submarine commanders had perfected their tactics to a deadly art form. They hunted in coordinated wolf packs, striking convoys under cover of darkness when visibility was minimal and escape nearly impossible. Their sonar systems could detect the rumble of merchant ship engines from miles away, giving them ample time to position themselves for devastating torpedo attacks. Once a convoy was spotted, the U-boats would shadow it for hours, sometimes days, waiting for the perfect moment to unleash their deadly cargo. What made these attacks so successful wasn't just German naval skill or superior technology. It was the fundamental advantage that submarines possessed over surface ships. A U-boat could remain hidden beneath the waves, virtually invisible to the naked eye and difficult to detect, even with the primitive sonar equipment available to most convoy escorts. They could choose when and where to attack, striking like ghosts from the depths before disappearing back into the black water. Allied naval commanders had tried everything they could think of to counter this threat. They organized larger convoy formations, hoping that strength in numbers would provide protection. They deployed more escort vessels, armed with depth charges and the latest anti-submarine weapons. They even experimented with aerial patrols, using long-range aircraft to spot surfaced U-boats from above. Yet despite all these efforts, the submarines continued to exact their deadly toll. The psychological impact on merchant sailors was devastating. These men knew that every voyage might be their last, that at any moment a torpedo could tear through their ship's hull and send them plunging into the icy Atlantic. Many vessels sailed with lifeboats constantly ready for launching, their crews sleeping fully clothed in case they needed to abandon ship at a moment's notice. The stress of this constant danger wore on everyone, from seasoned captains to teenage galley hands making their first ocean crossing. It was against this backdrop of fear and desperation that Thomas Mackenzie found himself aboard the merchant vessel SS Hartwell in March 1942. Mackenzie wasn't a naval officer or a trained scientist. He was simply a cook who had spent most of his career feeding hungry sailors on cargo ships that plied the dangerous North Atlantic routes. He was good at his job, known for creating decent meals from whatever provisions were available. But nothing about his background suggested he would become one of the most important figures in the war at sea. The Hartwell was part of Convoy HX-179, a collection of 43 merchant ships carrying vital supplies from Halifax to Liverpool. The convoy followed the standard formation, with faster vessels in the center and armed escorts positioned around the perimeter to provide protection against submarine attack. It was a routine crossing, or at least as routine as any voyage could be in waters prowled by German wolf packs. Mackenzie had been working in the ship's galley for 3 days when he noticed something peculiar. The Hartwell's cook stoves ran on a mixture of coal and oil, producing a distinctive smell that permeated the lower decks. But on this particular morning, as he prepared breakfast for the crew, Mackenzie detected an unusual odor mixing with the familiar cooking smells. It was sharp, almost metallic, completely different from anything he had encountered during his years at sea. At first, he assumed it was simply a problem with the ventilation system, or perhaps some new type of fuel oil the ship had taken on before departure. But as the day progressed, the smell grew stronger, and Mackenzie began to suspect that something more significant was happening. He mentioned it to a few crew members, but they dismissed his concerns, attributing the odor to the normal mix of industrial smells that accumulated on any working vessel. That evening, as Mackenzie cleaned his kitchen after serving dinner to the crew, he decided to investigate the source of the mysterious smell more thoroughly. He traced it through the ship's lower decks, following his nose through narrow corridors and storage compartments. The odor seemed strongest near the engine room, where the ship's massive diesel engines churned constantly to maintain the convoy's steady pace. What Mackenzie discovered would have seemed insignificant to anyone else. Near the engine room's ventilation intake, he found a small leak in one of the fuel lines. The leak was minor, barely visible, allowing only tiny drops of diesel fuel to escape and evaporate into the ship's air circulation system. Under normal circumstances, such during a small leak would have been routine maintenance and repaired without much fuss, but Mackenzie's trained nose had detected something that others had missed. The evaporating diesel fuel was creating a distinct chemical signature in the ship's exhaust, a signature that was being carried far beyond the vessel itself by ocean winds and currents. As he stood there examining the tiny leak, a wild idea began to form in his mind. What if this chemical signature could be detected by others? What if it was creating a trail that enemies could follow? The more Mackenzie thought about his discovery, the more convinced he became that he had stumbled onto something important. He knew that German submarines relied heavily on their ability to detect Allied ships from long distances, using everything from engine noise to visual sightings to locate their targets. But what if they were also using smell, detecting chemical traces carried on ocean breezes to track convoys across vast stretches of water? His theory seemed almost ridiculous, even to himself. How could something as simple as a fuel leak possibly matter in the context of modern naval warfare? Yet Mackenzie couldn't shake the feeling that his discovery was significant. He had spent enough time at sea to know that small details often made the difference between life and death, between reaching port safely and disappearing beneath the waves. The next morning, Mackenzie approached the ship's first officer with his concerns. He explained about the fuel leak, about the unusual smell, and about his suspicion that German submarines might be using chemical detection methods to track Allied convoys. The officer listened politely, but seemed skeptical about the cook's amateur theories of submarine warfare. However, something about Mackenzie's earnestness must have impressed him. because rather than dismissing the concerns outright, he agreed to investigate the matter further. The first officer, Lieutenant Commander Harold Pemberton, had seen enough strange occurrences during his 20 years at sea to know that sometimes the most unlikely observations proved crucial. He accompanied Mackenzie back to the engine room, where the cook pointed out the small fuel leak and demonstrated how the distinctive odor seemed to concentrate near the ventilation systems. Pemberton was initially skeptical, but as he examined the leak more closely, he began to understand Mackenzie's concerns. The diesel fuel wasn't just evaporating randomly. The ship's ventilation system was drawing the vapors up through the air ducts and expelling them through vents positioned along the vessel's superstructure. These vents created a chemical plume that extended far beyond the ship itself, carried by wind currents across miles of open ocean. What struck Pemberton as particularly alarming was the consistency of this chemical signature. Unlike engine noise, which could vary depending on speed and mechanical conditions, the fuel vapors created a steady, identifiable scent trail that lingered in the air long after the ship had passed. If German submarines had developed methods to detect these chemical traces, they would possess a tracking capability that Allied naval intelligence had never considered. Pemberton decided to conduct a simple experiment. He ordered the ship's engines reduced to minimum speed and had the crew seal the ventilation system temporarily to prevent any fuel vapors from escaping. For the next 6 hours, the Hartwell maintained its position within the convoy, while Pemberton monitored radio communications and watched for any signs of submarine activity. The results were remarkable. During those 6 hours, the convoy encountered no submarine contacts whatsoever. Sonar operators reported unusually quiet conditions, and the escort vessels detected none of the suspicious acoustic signatures that typically indicated U-boat presence. It was as if the German submarines had suddenly lost track of the convoy entirely. When Pemberton ordered the ventilation system reopened, the change was almost immediate. Within 2 hours, escort vessels began reporting sonar contacts, and radio intercepts suggested increased German submarine chatter in the area. The correlation seemed too strong to be mere coincidence. Pemberton immediately sent an encrypted message to Admiral Sir Percy Noble, Commander-in-Chief of Western Approaches, describing Mackenzie's discovery and the results of his preliminary test. The message was deliberately vague, referring only to a potential breakthrough in anti-submarine tactics discovered by crew members aboard a convoy vessel. The response from Naval Headquarters was swift and decisive. The Hartwell was ordered to break away from the convoy and proceed to a secure anchorage off the coast of Scotland, where a team of technical specialists would examine Mackenzie's findings in detail. The cook found himself transferred from his familiar galley to a stark interrogation room, where naval intelligence officers questioned him for hours about every aspect of his discovery. What emerged from these interrogations was a theory that seemed to explain many previously puzzling aspects of German submarine operations. Intelligence analysts had long wondered how U-boats managed to locate convoys with such uncanny accuracy, even when radio silence was maintained and weather conditions made visual detection nearly impossible. Mackenzie's discovery suggested that the Germans had developed sophisticated chemical detection methods, using specialized equipment to identify the unique scent signatures produced by different types of Allied vessels. The implications were staggering. If German submarines could track convoys by following chemical trails, then traditional anti-submarine tactics were fundamentally flawed. Changing course, altering speed, or maintaining radio silence would be useless if the enemy could simply follow the invisible chemical breadcrumbs left by every ship's engine and ventilation system. But Mackenzie's discovery also pointed toward a solution. If chemical signatures could be detected and followed, they could also be masked, altered, or used to deceive the enemy. The cook's simple observation about a fuel leak had opened up entirely new possibilities for naval warfare. possibilities that could shift the balance of power in the Battle of the Atlantic. Naval engineers immediately began developing methods to neutralize or disguise the chemical signatures produced. Some by Allied vessels' ships were fitted with special filters designed to capture fuel vapors before they could escape into the atmosphere. Others received chemical dispensers that could release false scent trails, creating phantom signatures designed to confuse German tracking systems. The most ingenious solution, however, came from Mackenzie himself. During one of his interrogation sessions, the cook suggested that rather than simply masking Allied chemical signatures, they should create false ones designed to lead German submarines into traps. By releasing specific chemical compounds at strategic locations, Allied forces could create artificial scent trails that would guide U-boats away from real convoys and toward waiting anti-submarine vessels. This deception tactic, which became known as Operation Nosebait, proved devastatingly effective. German submarine commanders, unaware that their chemical detection methods had been compromised, continued to follow what they believed were genuine convoy trails. Instead, they found themselves pursuing phantom targets that led them directly into carefully prepared ambushes. The first major success came in June 1942, when 3 German U-boats following a false chemical trail were detected and destroyed by Allied escort vessels lying in wait. The submarine commanders never understood what had gone wrong, reporting in their final radio transmissions that they had been tracking a large convoy that seemed to have vanished without trace. As word of these successes spread through Allied naval commands, Mackenzie's discovery began to influence anti-submarine strategy throughout the Atlantic theater. Convoy routes were redesigned to take advantage of prevailing wind patterns that would disperse chemical signatures away from known submarine patrol areas. New vessels were built with advanced ventilation systems designed to minimize detectable emissions. Even existing ships received modifications to reduce their chemical visibility to enemy detection methods. The psychological impact on German submarine crews was equally significant. As more U-boats fell victim to chemical deception tactics, commanders began to lose confidence in their tracking methods. Patrol reports described increasing confusion about convoy locations and movements. Some submarines spent days following false trails that led nowhere, wasting precious fuel and exposing themselves to Allied air patrols. By the autumn of 1942, the effectiveness of German submarine operations had declined dramatically. Where once U-boats had achieved devastating success rates against Allied shipping, they now struggled to locate targets and frequently found themselves outmaneuvered by convoy escorts who seemed to anticipate their every move. The transformation was so complete that German naval intelligence began investigating whether their submarine detection methods had been compromised. But they never suspected that the breakthrough had come from something as mundane as a ship's cook noticing an unusual smell in his galley. The very simplicity of Mackenzie's discovery made it impossible for enemy analysts to identify and counter. The ripple effects of Mackenzie's discovery extended far beyond individual convoy battles. Allied naval strategists began to understand that they had been fighting a war they didn't even know existed. For months, they had assumed German U-boats relied primarily on visual sightings, acoustic detection, and radio intercepts to locate their targets. The revelation that chemical tracking played a crucial role in submarine operations forced a complete reassessment of maritime warfare doctrine. Intelligence reports from captured German submariners slowly confirmed what Mackenzie had theorized. Under interrogation, several U-boat crew members mentioned specialized equipment aboard their vessels designed to detect what they called fuel ghosts, the distinctive chemical signatures that different Allied ships produced. These devices, originally developed for detecting oil spills and maritime disasters, had been adapted by German naval engineers into sophisticated tracking instruments capable of following scent trails across hundreds of miles of open ocean. The Germans had been particularly successful because Allied naval planners had never considered chemical concealment as a tactical necessity. Every ship in every convoy was essentially broadcasting its presence through invisible chemical signals that could be detected from vast distances. The U-boats didn't need to get close enough for visual or acoustic contact. They could track entire convoy formations from beyond the horizon, positioning themselves for attacks with deadly precision. What made Mackenzie's contribution even more remarkable was how it revealed the interconnected nature of modern naval warfare. The cook had stumbled upon a vulnerability that existed at meteorology and chemistry. Fuel vapors mix the intersection of engineering with ocean air currents in predictable patterns, creating chemical maps that skilled operators could read like navigational charts. Wind direction, temperature variations, and atmospheric pressure all influenced how these invisible trails developed and dispersed. Allied scientists working with Mackenzie's findings discovered that different types of vessels produced distinctly different chemical signatures. Tankers carrying petroleum products left traces that could be distinguished from cargo ships hauling manufactured goods. Military escorts running on high-octane fuel created patterns unlike merchant vessels burning cheaper diesel. German submarine commanders had learned to identify these signatures, allowing them to prioritize targets and plan attacks accordingly. The sophistication of German chemical detection methods became clear when Allied researchers examined captured U-boat equipment. The devices were marvels of engineering, capable of distinguishing between dozens of different chemical compounds and tracking multiple scent trails simultaneously. German had been crews trained to interpret these readings with almost scientific precision, creating detailed chemical maps of Allied convoy movements. But Mackenzie's discovery had given the Allies something even more valuable than knowledge of enemy capabilities. It had provided them with the tools to turn those capabilities into weaknesses. Once they understood how chemical detection worked, Allied engineers could design countermeasures that transformed German strengths into fatal vulnerabilities. The development of chemical camouflage became a priority project involving some of the war's brightest scientific minds. Researchers experimented with dozens of different compounds designed to mask or alter the natural chemical signatures produced by Allied vessels. Some solutions involved neutralizing agents that would bind with fuel vapors before they could escape into the atmosphere. Others used chemical decoys that would create false signatures designed to confuse enemy detection equipment. The most successful approach combined multiple deception techniques into comprehensive chemical warfare strategies. Allied vessels began carrying specialized equipment that could produce artificial scent trails on command. These devices allowed convoy commanders to create phantom formations that appeared to split and merge in ways that confused German tracking efforts. A single convoy could appear to be 3 or 4 separate groups, each heading in different directions, making it impossible for U-boat commanders to determine which target was real. Weather conditions played a crucial role in these deception operations. Allied meteorologists worked closely with naval tacticians to predict how atmospheric conditions would affect chemical dispersion patterns. Convoys were routed to take advantage of favorable wind conditions that would carry false chemical signals away from real ship positions, while dispersing genuine signatures before they could be detected. The training of Allied personnel in chemical deception tactics became as important as traditional naval warfare instruction. Crew members learned to operate the new chemical dispensing equipment, to recognize when their vessels might be producing detectable signatures, and to coordinate with other ships to create effective deception patterns. Even merchant sailors, previously concerned only with reaching their destinations safely, became active participants in sophisticated anti-submarine operations. Mackenzie himself became an unlikely celebrity within Allied naval circles. The humble cook found himself consulting with admirals and scientists, explaining the subtle details of how different fuel mixtures and engine configurations affected chemical emissions. His practical experience with shipboard systems proved invaluable in designing countermeasures that actually worked under real operational conditions. The success of chemical deception tactics began to show in the statistics. German submarine effectiveness, which had peaked in early 1942, declined steadily throughout the latter half of the year. U-boat commanders reported increasing difficulty in locating targets, and many patrols returned to base without achieving any sinkings. The fearsome wolf pack tactics that had terrorized Allied shipping became increasingly ineffective as submarines found themselves chasing phantom convoys that led nowhere. German naval intelligence struggled to understand what had changed. Their submarine commanders were as skilled as ever. Their equipment remained technically superior. Yet somehow the Allies had gained an advantage that seemed to defy explanation. Intelligence reports from the period show growing confusion within German naval headquarters as successful attacks became increasingly rare while submarine losses mounted. The psychological impact on U-boat crews was devastating. These men had grown accustomed to hunting Allied shipping with near impunity, confident in their ability to detect and destroy enemy vessels. Suddenly, they found themselves operating in an environment where their most reliable detection methods seemed to have failed completely. Patrol reports described a growing sense of paranoia and confusion as submarines wandered vast stretches of ocean without finding targets that their instruments insisted should be nearby. Some German commanders began to suspect that Allied forces had developed new types of jamming equipment designed to interfere with chemical detection systems. Others theorized that the Allies had discovered some method of completely eliminating their ships' chemical signatures. A few even suggested that German detection equipment had been sabotaged or was malfunctioning on a systematic scale. The truth was both simpler and more complex than any of these theories. Mackenzie's discovery had revealed that the invisible war being fought in the chemistry of ocean air was just as important as the visible battles between ships and submarines. By learning to control and manipulate chemical signatures, the Allies had gained mastery over a battlefield that the Germans never realized they had lost. As 1942 drew to a close, the transformation in the Battle of the Atlantic was undeniable. The shipping losses that had threatened Britain's survival dropped dramatically, while German submarine casualties increased to unsustainable levels. The U-boat menace that had seemed invincible just months earlier was being systematically dismantled by tactics that grew directly from one cook's observation about an unusual smell in his galley. And so, the story of Thomas Mackenzie reminds us that the greatest breakthroughs often come from the most unexpected places. A humble cook, armed with nothing more than a keen nose and relentless curiosity, had accomplished what teams of naval strategists and brilliant engineers could not. His simple observation about a fuel leak transformed the entire course of the war at sea, saving countless lives and helping to secure Allied victory. Mackenzie's discovery proves that in warfare, as in life, the smallest details can carry the greatest consequences. While admirals planned grand strategies and scientists developed sophisticated weapons, it was an ordinary man doing an ordinary job who noticed something extraordinary. His willingness to investigate an unusual smell, to ask uncomfortable questions, and to persist despite initial skepticism had changed the fate of nations. The Battle of the Atlantic would continue for years, but never again would German U-boats enjoy the devastating advantages they had possessed before Mackenzie's revelation. The invisible war fought in chemical signatures and scent trails had been won by the Allies, thanks to one cook who refused to ignore what others dismissed as insignificant. Sometimes the most powerful weapons are hidden in the most mundane places, waiting for someone with the wisdom to recognize their potential. Thomas Mackenzie had that wisdom, and the world would never be the same.